on camera. Amazing. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And for those of you watching online, to the IHR Digital History Seminar, not at the IHR today, at the UCL. And we are going to be today exploring the Living with Machines project, which is, as they'll explain in a few minutes, is very much looking at considering digital history approaches, particularly looking at the 19th century in relationship to the industrialization. There's lots of space on this side over here. Please come through. Particularly this afternoon, going to be looking at geographical mapping aspects of that. And we've got 4 speakers with us today. And we've got Daniel Wilson, who's an historian of modern Britain with a focus on science and technology. Brash, and particularly in terms of looking at the politics of the digital. And then alongside, we've got Daniel van Strijn, who's a digital curator for the Living with Machines project, particularly interested in the use of natural language processing methods on historical collections and deep learning for research and managing digital collections. And then we have Casper Bielen, who's a digital historian exploring the application of machine learning to humanities research. And finally, Katie McDonald, who's going to begin and introduce us. She's an historian of 18th century France, originally looking at intersection of political culture and history of science and technology, but also very much interested in mapping and digital mapping as well. Without further ado, welcome everyone, and I'll pass over to Katie to kick us off.
Yep.
Over to you.
Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be here. We are just over the road at the Alan Turing Institute inside the British Library, which may be a very strange kind of place for humanities people to visit, but if you're, nearby, come say hello. It's really not so terrifying. We order our coffee from an iPad. Witnesses. So I'm going to get us started. We're going to cycle through different sections, different people talking through this presentation, and we will go quite quick. But if there's anything that we say that really doesn't make any sense to you, please feel free to raise a hand, ask for a clarification. We've invented, like all institutions, acronyms and things like that may not make any sense to you, and hopefully those will not be present, but you never know. All right, so the Living with Machines project is just the basics, funded by the AHRC as part of the UKRI Strategic Priorities Fund. As an American, all of these were new acronyms for me as well. So it's one of the largest humanities science collaborations in UK history. As I said, we're based at the Alan Turing Institute in collaboration with the BL, and our partner institutions are the places where primarily our COIs have primary appointments. This is us. This is everyone right now, yeah. Sometimes it changes, but I think this is pretty much up to date. We're 23 strong, lots of different roles. Our PI is Ruth Honor, who's a digital literary historian at Queen Mary. And you've already heard about us. So these are the people who are involved in all the various aspects of the research we'll talk about today. You can see there's lots of different roles that people play, and everything that we'll talk about today would not have been possible without the generosity and brilliance of Chris Fleet at the National Library of Scotland. So we just major acknowledgements for his work with us. Yeah, okay, so moving on. What is Living Machines intellectually? It is a project using machines to understand historical machines. We talk about ourselves in our project charter as a radical collaboration between curators, historians, computational linguists, geographers, and data scientists. The data scientists themselves come from many different disciplinary backgrounds. We're working with digitized collections from the long 19th century. We're using iterative computational methods to understand those collections. And rather than seeing our end goal as producing a kind of fancy interface, we are doing research and producing open data sets and kind of following in the tradition of reproducible research, which is very important at the Turing. So, very quickly, it's worth saying that Living with Machines is, we don't think of ourselves as a history of the Industrial Revolution. We are not a history of inventing machines. And we're definitely not a project that is a lone scholar sitting silently in the archive for 3 years and then appearing magically. We are a year and a bit into a 5-year project. So this is quite early research. And as we were talking about earlier with Justin and Richard, it does take some time to get through the kind of thinking about our experimental methods, getting to data that we can use to think like historians with. So you're going to kind of see where we are in that process. Living with Machines is an inquiry into the role that machines played in British lives. It is an investigation into what it means to use computational analysis to explore these really massive materials that were created during the 19th century. So I mentioned radical collaboration. What is that? For us, it means a few things. It means that we have a very flexible and in many ways non-hierarchical project structure. We, over the fall, abolished our first kind of organizational method, which was a series of labs. And on Thursday and Friday of this week, we will reconstitute ourselves in some sort of new set of entities, which we don't have a name yet for. And it's a very much a bottom-up research project. So Ruth didn't hire us all and tell us what to go work on. We are working together to develop our research questions in tandem as we discover our collections. We have multiple kinds of learning and doing, everything from hack sessions to reading groups to one-on-one brainstorming, consulting with lots of external researchers. And as I mentioned, this all leads us to develop our goals collectively. We think of our work as a kind of sequence. And so we hope that by being able to think methodologically and historically and linguistically, everyone on the project will get the kinds of career milestones that they need to be successful after the project, while also participating in this very interdisciplinary work. And then finally, because this is a big project in a kind of new institutional setting, at least for DH, we're meant to be very self-reflexive about what we're doing, and iterate and try to improve on how we collaborate, how we develop ideas, and to share that with the community. All right, so today we're really going to focus on just one set of primary sources that we're looking at, which are the Ordnance Survey maps that have been provided by the NLS. And the reason that we're doing that is because maps are really one of the essential sources for thinking about place and space in the 19th century. So place is really important in the project. Along with time, it's a kind of connective tissue between all the people and events and institutions that we encounter in our sources. And we really have an opportunity to think about the construction of place, ideas about places, as well as the construction of the physical landscape during industrialization, and how these are represented in our sources. So, for example, we're really interested in the discrete appearance of place, like toponyms in text. We're interested in the continuous representation of place in visual materials like maps, and then a kind of hybrid of tabular data, which might be derived from text or visual information, either in the 19th century or more recently. So in order to really manage and think with these different kinds of spatial data and the relationships between them, we're trying to think outside the box about how we digitize and annotate historical spatial information. So in particular, that's meant for us returning to the drawing board to assess how we capture historical spatial information in the context of the sources that that information appears in. And so this is why realizing that maps are a continuous and not discrete representation of space is a really core idea for us. And we're not alone in kind of returning or arriving at visual material as a core source for digital humanities. Thomas Smits and Melvin Wevers have been doing really interesting work and wrote this wonderful article, which if you haven't read, you should take a look at, that illustrates their work with using computer vision on historical newspaper images and historical newspapers. And they talk about this visual digital turn. So as a field, DH has grossly neglected visual content, causing a lopsided representation of all sorts of digitized archives. Therefore, we call for a turn toward the visual and digital humanities research. So we're not alone. And it's really been exciting and fruitful to put ourselves in front of this visual material in a way that is quite different from, say, spatial historians 10 to 15 years ago. And with that, Daniel's going to talk a little bit about our sources.
Thank you, Katie. So I'm just going to say a few very quick words about our map sources. So we're working with the Ordnance Survey of Great Britain maps. The OS was founded in the late 18th century in response to the threat of invasion from France. And people who make use of the OS today, both everyday people, whether they're walkers or surveyors, or even historians, often use them as if they represent ground truth in some sort of direct, unproblematic way. Now, thinking about source criticism, historians are quite used to the kind of issues arising from textual sources, but perhaps aren't trained in using this particular type of visual source, much in the same way that many historians aren't trained in, for example, art history, and can be tempted to use those sources somewhat uncritically. So one of the good things about the OS for us is that the founding of the OS coincides very much with the beginning of industrialization. So in terms of the periodization of our project, this is a great sort of first snapshot in time. Just going to let these people sit down for a second. Sorry. Yes, as I was saying, we take for granted what the OS is, but it's worth remembering something about its origins, which I'll come to in a second, but it remains a national map agency to this day. And that they claim that their detailed mapping reflects features on the ground. So there's this premium on accuracy, an idea of kind of ground truth behind the source, which in a way is useful to us because it is an accurate reflection as far as one can get one of the landscape of the 19th century, but we need to be aware constantly that this is a sort of constructed source. So just to give you an example of the kind of thing that you find in the OS, here's a map of Portsmouth from the late 19th century. And those of you familiar with that particular place will notice there's a problem with this map, which is that there's no detail on this kind of key interesting part. And that's for the reason that this is a naval dockyard. So it's been blanked out of the map in order not to kind of reveal to the enemy where exactly the ships are being constructed and repaired and so on. And this is unsurprising if you think about the origins of the OS being a military sort of exercise in mapping. But this is just one sort of, I suppose, somewhat obvious example of the kind of bias one might find in using this particular kind of source. So I just wanted to flag this up, as a way of kind of issuing a slight warning about this kind of question of ground truth, which we might be tempted into sort of running with, as well as this kind of very explicit lack in the map on absence. There are other kinds of gaps in the record which are both systematic and yet perhaps unconscious, which we also want to be aware of, and we're trying to take notice of as we work through our sources. And this kind of becomes important when you work at scale with these sources, because one of the things that we're interested in trying to understand is how these practices of surveying may have obscured, hidden systematically certain features that we might be interested in thinking about. So one question we have when thinking about an industrializing landscape is, how are the presences and absences both before and after industrialization represented on these maps? Is there something systematic we can uncover when we start to look at these kind of sources at scale, when we aggregate all of these, if you like, local sort of qualitative features of the map? When we add this all together, is there something we can say that's a bit more systematic? And just a few words quickly about the maps we're working with. So the British Library holds the biggest collection in existence, 4.5 million sheets, and these are across different series, scales, editions, which I think we'll talk about in a moment in a bit more detail. And yeah, one of the questions, the research issues that we're interested in is how these maps get populated, both literally with people, but also with particular features. So with that, I'll hand over. Or shall I say a word about this? I'll say a word about this too.
Yeah, you can do that.
Yeah, okay. So we were, as Katie mentioned, we were fortunate to have been given a set of maps from the National Library of Scotland, who happens to have done very thorough work digitising the maps of that nation, but also some of England is covered in the next collection. So, for example, this is the kind of, I suppose, working metadata that we received from the National Library of Scotland. And part of our job has been just really to just get a grip on what there is in this corpus. As you can see, there's lots of different scales in existence, some of which overlap in time, some of which don't. And really, we've been doing some quite, thanks to our colleague Olivia Vane, largely, I suppose, detailed catalogue analysis to try and understand really what there is in the collection and where gaps might occur, not only within maps themselves, but in terms of the kind of overall national coverage. I think I'll quickly move on. So the next one. So through this kind of visualization, Olivia has managed to give us a kind of sense running through time sort of vertically along this series, and also across different editions and scales of maps. Just a quick sort of glimpse of where the maps exist and where they don't. So in terms of kind of selecting things like case studies for further research and that kind of exercise, this is both useful for us, but also hopefully will be the kind of thing we can then give back to the library where these kind of materials originated, to try and enrich their own understanding of their own collection. So we chose to focus on Lancashire for obvious sorts of reasons, but also for the reason that we happen to have other sources of which the sample available to us was Lancashire, namely newspapers. So again, using that tool that you just saw in the previous slide that Olivia built, we're able to focus in on different features here. And as you can see, there's a kind of timestamp that runs across these different series. So as we start to work qualitatively with these maps, we can start to get a grip both on the kind of publication history, but also on kind of material that might exist before the OS maps came into existence. So things like surveyor's drawings, which exist in manuscript form, and so on. And again, this collection runs right up until the present day. I think I'll stop talking so much about maps.
Okay, great.
We're not going to go into those code maps. So maps is data.
That's
Katie?
great. Yeah, and then we'll move on. All right. So maybe just skip to that one, and then and then the next one. Yeah. Okay, great. So, so the kind of premise behind doing this work is that we want to treat maps as data, and not just extract data from maps and forget about the map. And so there's just been a lot of, I think, next slide. There's been a lot of emphasis in spatial history. can't figure out now if we're allowed to say spatial history anymore, if we always say spatial humanities. But in spatial history, humanities, of creating vector data, and that when you're doing spatial history and you're using maps, that the thing that you're doing is creating vector data. You're creating points and lines and polygons that you'll then use GIS software to analyze in conjunction with other data sets, for example. And so what you're doing is you're turning the raster data of that map into vector data. And a lot of the kind of what, data science or GI science world has been focused on as a task is how to automate that process. And so Yaoyi Cheng, he's an expert in sort of automated or computational research with serial map collections, kind of puts this nicely here. He says, once a user identifies the maps of interest, the next challenge is to efficiently convert the map content to machine-readable format. The mainstream approach for this purpose still relies heavily on manual work. I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room who have been manually drawing things for years, with some help from raster to vector conversion software, which is the kind of thing that GI scientists have been developing. And so, what's interesting is to step back from this assumption, right? That the thing that you do with a map that's been scanned is to turn it into points, lines, and polygons. So how can we make better use of maps as a continuous representation of space to really think about how there are challenges with using maps as data about the historical landscape, the kinds of questions about bias that Daniel was talking about. And this kind of, I think, changes the way that we have an opportunity to do spatial history. So making maps into data. So next slide. And just as an example of what this means, like visually, when you are vectorizing railroad tracks, which is something that has been done, right? You're kind of extracting this very, very, very tiny piece of information from a very rich document. And this is all that you then have to work with, right? You're creating a kind of abstracted idea about the railroad network, and you lose all of that contextual information, visual information about the map. And so because railroads are such a kind of fundamental part of the changing landscape in the 19th century, this is immediately something that we were thinking about. And it's also a really nice example of the potential limitations of vector data as like the core thing that you would use from historical map collections. And so we're quite interested in thinking about what the expansion of railroads affects beyond sort of transport efficiency, or the kind of questions that economic historians might be more interested in. You may have gathered so far that none of us are economic historians. And so we have been thinking about how we might do this using computer vision methods to think through, what we call it rail space, and that makes sense in the context of our project, but it doesn't make sense to you. But the space around the tracks, right? So rail spaces rather than just the rail. How does it change communities? When railroads arrive with the myriad of kind of infrastructure and structure that come with them, what does it replace? And as Daniel said, it's not just looking at that in one place, which is what historians have been very good at doing for generations, but really being able to do that at scale, to look at patterns, discontinuities, things like this, and to then afterwards kind of burrow down into case studies. All right, so almost done. And so this is just an example of the kinds of things we've really broken down in the project, data that we can look at, capture in a map as visual data and textual data. And so here is just a kind of nice example of some experiments that we're doing with a tool called Strabo, created by Yaoyi Cheng and some of his colleagues at USC and UC Boulder, to automatically extract text but to geolocate that text and to think about the text as a network of information itself connected to the visual information, which we will use different methods to look at, which is exactly what Daniel will talk about.
So yeah, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the process that we use to extract the visual information from maps, and trying to keep in mind what Daniel and Katie have already discussed about some of the ambiguities in the information in the map. So Katie mentioned this project to kind of like vectorize and extract data. So there are projects using computer vision to basically automate that process. But that's not exactly what we wanted to do. So we wanted something, that was slightly more flexible, but also allowed a little bit more for those ambiguities in what was actually represented in the map. So this is the same image that Katie showed. And just to give you an example of some of the types of symbols that we're looking for. So with the OS maps, you do start to get a much more kind of systematic representation of some things like trees, woodlands. And the other thing that we might be interested in is things like buildings, which have like a representation as a human we can quite quickly identify, but they're not necessarily like all the exact same shape or size or layout. So what we wanted to do is to kind of develop a method that would allow us to kind of get at this information in a semi-automatic way, whilst also leaning a bit into those ambiguities. So getting back a little bit to this question of like how we classify visual entities, I think this is one of the things that we grappled with quite a bit when we started this research. So depending on how familiar you are with computer vision research, you probably will have seen something like this be as a picture showing how self-driving cars work. So you would hopefully have like pedestrians and cyclists like with a box around them, so the car knows not to like run those people down. And this is all like different ways in which we can get at these kind of visual entities in a map, going from like the most the least granular, where you just have like the network, the model knows that there's these things in the image, but there's no information about where that is in the image, to this kind of instant segmentation where like each pixel of the image is like, okay, this is a cube or this is a bottle. And I think when you first see this, the intuitive thing might be to be like, we want that one because that's like the most detail. And this gets back a little bit to doing this in the context of Living Machines, because we're not like a project that's aiming to like do automatic work with maps in the same way as people doing the kind of vector automation are trying to do. So one of the questions is like, what granularity of annotations do we actually need to get at the information in the map? So like when we look at a map as a historian or as a kind of non-expert, like at what scale can we say like that is a useful unit of information? The other question that we kind of are grappling with is how painful the annotation process is, because in the approach we're taking, basically we create some labeled data and then a model learns from that labeled data. And we want to minimize the amount of labeling we have to do and also minimize how painful that is. So in the end, we went for some kind of variant on this version of A. And then the next step is basically to pass it through like a model, which we haven't kind of created. This is like a model that's widely used by computer vision researchers to do various computer vision tasks. But in this case, it's a classification. So what we have is some labeled examples. As input, we have an image, then we have some labeled examples that we want the network to predict. And what the model essentially does is learn from that input what features of the input are useful for predicting the label. So in this case, like something about a car makes it look like a car, and this model will hopefully work out what that is without you having to explicitly tell it that information. So all you have to do is provide the labels. Yes, next slide. So getting back to this idea of kind of vector versus other information on the map. So here, it's a little bit hard to see, but you have these kind of railroad tracks here as this kind of vector information. And as Katie mentioned, that's like a very kind of small bit of information from the map. So it's basically a line across the map. And what we wanted to do is get at this kind of contextual information around the rails as well. So one of the challenges that we have if we take this classification approach is to actually like think about how we break up a map into a useful unit of information for this kind of task. So if you do like a computer vision 101 in kind of intro lesson, the example is usually like cats and dogs. Like if you have a photo of a cat and a dog, then knowing like is there a cat or a dog in it is kind of enough information. In the case of a map, saying there's like a railroad in a map that's like this big is not that useful. But we also didn't want to like go in and draw dots across all of this. So essentially what the approach we've taken is to kind of tile the maps into these smaller segments. And then we hope that by doing that, we get this kind of richer information. So we have this information about the tracks, but also what we're starting to then do is to classify these small segments of the map. So this is something we're still working on. And at the moment, the way we're doing it is fairly crude, but basically we chop the map into like 100 or 200 or 50 tiles. And then we're annotating each of those tiles with some classes. And I'll get back a little bit to that in a moment. So I just reread the blurb before I came here, and I know one of the things we said is like, does modern computer vision work for historical maps? And one of the things that's like been really important in computer vision over the past kind of 5-10 years is this idea of transfer learning, where you take a model trained on one task and then use that as information for another task. So in this case, what often happens is that a model is trained on this ImageNet database. So this is a database of like millions and millions of images based on the kind of WordNet hierarchy. So you have things like watercraft, and then you get more granular to like sailboats and particular types of sailboats. And what's really powerful about these pre-trained models is that in learning how to classify sailboats from dogs, it learns some very fundamental visual features that occur in like pretty much everything. So that reduces drastically the amount of labeled data that we need to actually feed our model to get fairly good results. Getting back quickly to another quite important thing for us is this idea of working in notebooks and trying to make the process of developing this research quite quick, but also making it explicit, like what steps we took. So for all of the work we've done for this so far, like the majority of it has been done in notebooks, and partly that's been done to like explore the research questions themselves, but also as a way of like educating ourselves within the project team. So basically trying to teach ourselves some of this stuff. And one of the nice things about that, of course, is that you can quite easily display visual things in these notebooks, which can be a little bit more difficult to do otherwise. And this is kind of what kind of early version of our classification task ended up looking like. So we did that actual classification within a notebook environment, and partly that, so when you're like doing this, you're training the model, you annotate, you train the model. So there's this kind of instant feedback loop, rather than doing a load of annotations up front and then either giving it to someone else or training the model yourself. You have this kind of more direct relationship between the two. And I think that's really important, getting back at this ambiguity, because in the current way of doing this, we're tiling the maps and then applying classes. So in this example, we've got building or no building. And one of the things that we wanted to be able to do is to very quickly change what labels we're using. So we're not upfront deciding, okay, we're going to look at these 5 entities and then that's all we're going to annotate. But actually very quickly we could say, not interested in that anymore. We want to also look at that. But one of the things that you notice when you're doing these annotations is because you're not kind of drawing pixels around, sometimes you have these ambiguous things where you might have a bit of a building in the corner, you're like, oh, what should I label that? Or if we're doing the classification of different types of railways, you might have like more than one thing in that. And that's something we're kind of still working out a little bit. But I think actually doing the annotations as the person who will be consuming the model is like really powerful for also getting at the limitations in terms of what the model is going to learn from. And then just to kind of get back to this kind of whether it's possible. So for most of these things that we've done so far, we've worked with around 200 labeled examples. And usually we've got our models into like the high 90%, so this improved slightly. And also the time to train those models is very quick. So our hope with this is that this is something that can be used outside the project. So it's not something where you need like an army of PhDs or undergraduates labeling data for you. It's something that you could like in an afternoon kind of click through some annotations and actually train a useful model. And then what we get from this, and this is like a very crude example, but getting back to this idea of maps as data, is that once we have this information about like what classes are in a map and how many tiles we've classified, how many tiles we've chopped a map into, you can get at things like density or doing things like searching. So in this example, it's just like distribution of how densely a map is covered with trees. So this is a really kind of toy example, but it's just to show you the kind of things that we hope to be able to do. And then kind of getting a little bit more towards what we want to do. So in this example, like this is again very crude, but we have things like there's a category for no building, there's a category for trees, and this could go like on and on. So one thing we might be able to do then, which is kind of interesting in the library perspective, is actually search for maps in the kind of way you would search for a catalogue. So say, I want maps which have like 50% coverage of buildings, but I also want trees and I don't want something else. So it's a kind of way of actually doing discovery of visual collections. I think that will be quite useful. The other thing that we're quite keen to do is actually to think about like how we can share this information. So even though it's not that time consuming to share these, to train these models, we also want to be able to share the outputs in a way that will be usable by other researchers. And then just the final kind of disclaimer that this kind of classification approach doesn't work for everything we're looking for on a map. So another thing we've played around a little bit is this idea of visual querying. So this is a notebook Casper made where you basically give an example of what you're looking for and then you get back similar. And in this case, there's only one because we had quite a small collection of images. But for things that don't appear on the map a lot, you don't want to sit there annotating for like hours saying, no, it's not there, it's not there, it's not there. What you might want to do instead of say, this is what I'm looking for, show me more of those. I think that's it for me.
So now we switch from, let's say, the visual analysis to the text analysis. So besides those visual features, maps also contain a lot of text data. And these are basically like a small additional pointers of extra information on top of the visual layer, which tells what is there. And it's quite selective, so it's mostly larger buildings or buildings which were important to the people who made those maps, or like structural features like footpaths often are mentioned. But maps actually still contain quite a lot of text. So what can we do with this text? One way of, I will explain soon, but for now, these texts are still like hidden in the map somewhere, but luckily for the 1900, we have access to the GB 1900 dataset, which is which was a crowdsourcing project which transcribed all those texts on the map. So we have access to, let's say, all those small strings which are then geotagged using crowdsourcing. And next one. And what we plan to do, we already showed the slide, but so GP1900 unfortunately only has information from, like, let's say the later part of the 19th century. We're also trying to work backwards and use existing software, being fine-tuning, tweaking existing software to also get at labels on earlier maps, on 8050, for example. Next one, please. So what can we do? Unfortunately, we only now have around 1900, but what can we do with this data? So GB1900, again, is like a transcription of all those labels on the map. It contains still quite some information, so it contains like each text string is annotated by geolocation. And it has quite some labels. So it has 2.6 million labels. And many are kind of unique, so it has a very long tail, basically. So it's a bit, but not all of them. So it's not surprising, but like we still have quite some recurrent labels. Like some labels really are repeated across the maps, which makes it interesting for us to research those labels. Especially when we break down those labels by words, we can maybe find more frequent patterns on the map. So the distribution is not ideal. There's a very long tail, and a few ones appear very often, but still we can do with it. It's in many ways not that different from language. If you would look at the distribution of words for very bad OCR, you would maybe see something similar. So we will take this kind of similarity between labels and text on a map to further later on. Next slide. So one simple thing we did so far is just to also make notebooks where we really allow researchers to quickly explore this GP1900 data set by showing where do those labels actually occur on the map. So this one, for example, shows where do schools occur in UK, and we did some very easy dimensionality reduction by showing the longitude and latitude of schools across the UK. Next slide, please. And you can also trace some labels through space. So this shows all the markers for like the railways in Britain. So you can actually also even use these labels to follow rail over time, over space. But what we're actually doing now, so basically so far the notebook actually looks where are things, but this tells very much how do these things relate to each other. So what we are looking at now, like we're refining the analysis by looking at the relations between labels over space. How are those labels actually positioned in relation to each other? So how do these connections change over time? For example, do we see specific connections between schools and church more often in certain places than in others? So what we're basically doing here is like building a network from the label data. So this also allows us to look at to use centrality measures, see how important are those buildings in their local context. But for example, we can also start doing random walks over this graph. So we create a network and then can start just walking over it. For example, you could then say like, how many times do I encounter a pub on my way to church, for example? This would be quite easy to do in this kind of analysis. Next slide. But also we use it for a more, once we create this kind of graphs, we can, basically what we then can do is like, we can randomly walk over them and kind of generate something which is close to sentences. So you can see here I have again, it's an example. If we start randomly walking over this graph, I can kind of create sentences of church, vicarage, library. So again, we can then think of how can we analyze these labels in the same way, can we analyze space in the same way we analyze language, especially me coming from like a language background was quite interested in. So basically what we want to do, and here the terminology gets very confusing, we want to vectorize those labels. And not vectorizing in the sense as putting those associating words with like coordinates, but actually vectorizing those words in the sense that the vector representation kind of captures how those words appear in the local context. And here we actually use intuition from language modeling. So a lot of language modeling is inspired by this distributional hypothesis that you can kind of guess the meaning of a word based on its context. So if I show you a sentence and I hide one word, a human is quite likely to be able to predict what this word was. And if you teach a machine to do the same, this machine actually gets a kind of understanding of language. So we actually apply the same hypothesis to space. Like, can you guess the meaning of a building by knowing its context? And actually, for now, this works fairly well. Next, there's a video hidden there. Could you try to play it?
Oh, maybe it didn't transfer.
I think
it's the next slide, actually.
If you
Transfer
Is it that one?
slideshow.
okay.
It's on the first one. Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
No problem.
I thought, yeah,
Can
sorry.
you describe it?
Yes.
Oh, that might work.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
So this actually shows what happens when you vectorize labels. So by basically what we did, we looked like, do those labels which belong to certain sphere, do they occupy a different area in the vector space? So these are churches, and then factories kind of are situated somewhere differently. And this is just a very early experiment. But actually, we want to see if we use a language model on labels, can we actually get something meaningful out of it? If you go back to the slide. So in one way, it already worked quite well. For example, if you look at which labels are similar to the label school, we find that of all the 10,000 words the computer could choose from, that the aggregation appears really closely. So we're quite happy with that. And we can also see how similar are those labels. For example, school is more similar to church than to factory, which is makes sense. So next slide. So then one other benefit of this analysis, we can actually do kind of semantic analysis across different sort types. So we get sources. So one thing we were interested in, like, when you think about semantic or organization of space or discourse, are there similarities between those? So one thing we looked at is, if you train also a language model on books, are those vectors kind of similar as if you train them on spatial information? And somehow it did. So basically what this means is that things which are far away in text are also far away in space, and things which are close in text are also close in space, which is quite an interesting finding. So this basically shows it very, very easily. So you can see that here showing the comparison, school to office, and here how similar those two vectors are for a book corpus and for our GP1900 data. And there's that means also, again, this is an early experiment, but there's quite some correlation between those similarities. So again, this was kind of a surprising finding that semantics kind of in space and text are kind of relatable to each other. We don't know exactly how, but again, this is an early experiment.
No one's doing this.
They're like, let's go to the pub. You could probably be quite quick. Yeah.
Okay.
What's the next slide? Outputs.
Yeah, so other Daniel has mentioned a little bit the idea behind using notebooks, which are a kind of coding environment that non-coders can sort of understand, because it's got kind of semantic meaning in the notebook for you to follow what's happening. Methods, models will be shared. Hopefully, metadata will be fed back. Images, maybe potentially in the future. I'm just going to say a few general words. Next slide, please. About how we actually did this work, because in a way this goes back to Katie's point at the start. One of our project's aims is to think a little bit about method in general terms and about collaboration. Most historians aren't really used to working in this kind of team with 5, 6, 7, 8 people in the room, all feeding in kind of ideas. So this particular work on maps was only really possible by collaboration, which is sort of obvious if you see it now, but at the time we had to get the right people in the room at the same time. And that sounds kind of obvious, but if you don't have the resources that we do, it's quite hard to do that. So we were fortunate enough to be able to distribute the work among people. People with different specialisms could contribute the things that they were good at, and the research was iterative, which is to say it fed back in a circle. The possibilities of the tools influenced the kind of questions we were interested in, and the questions generated kind of insights about what kind of tools might be appropriate, and so on. So that's one thing. Katie's hinted at some of the work and the literature that exists in the field, but no one really has done this kind of work, combining kind of labels on maps with kind of geolocation in the same kind of way. So there wasn't a kind of exciting feeling that we were, in the course of this collaboration, actually doing something quite new. And by sort of collaborating on quite simple experiments, we were able to get confidence that the methods were, if not kind of perfect, at least yielding sort of insights quite quickly, and then we could focus on things that appear to work well. Again, the idea of a hack day was something that we ended up sort of going with, even though that's not even though that may to some people imply a kind of competitive sort of activity. In this case, that isn't the way this worked. The methods of working collaboratively in this kind of like hack spirit lends itself to creativity, not only because of the kind of problem solving in the sense that you need to respond to problems in real time, but also, as I already mentioned, in formulating new research questions sort of on the fly. And that can take you into kind of different directions that you weren't expecting, as I think Casper's comments hinted. And then finally, again, this relates a little bit to the resources that we're fortunate to have in our project, but there is quite a high sort of entry cost in terms of infrastructure and also personnel. So quite a lot of investment in skills is necessary to get people sort of able to have a kind of conversation around these tools. But once that sort of, let's say, minimal level of understanding is in place, you can actually start to move quite quickly. So there is quite a high benefit to cost ratio eventually. And in addition, there's quite a lot of upskilling that happens, and a kind of shared understanding in this kind of agile research culture, which is the kind of thing people often talk about. I think we're going to end there. Is there anything else we need to say? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to open up to questions, and indeed, those of you following online, feel free to tweet in some questions as well. I'm going to get the speakers to move in. Actually, I'm on camera, which is really what we don't want. Not really want that either. So I'm going to get them to slide down a little bit, exactly as they're doing. Maybe we can get a little cozy so that Daniel gets onto the screen as well. And opening up to questions. And I'm sure there must be many. I'll start here, and then I'll move over to there. Go ahead.
I was just interested whether you were looking at canals as well as railway lines, or not.
Canals.
The canal network, and whether you were looking at the canal network and comparing that with the railway network, or not. Because I was just thinking in like earlier parts of the Industrial Revolution, whether canals would have had a greater significance or not. I don't know. I was just imagining whether you were looking at the canal networks as well as the railways, and whether there was,
We're not currently, but we may do, and canals obviously feature massively in any sort of like analysis of transportation, industrialization, and so forth. I suppose we, as I mentioned, have these OS maps, which, well, the majority of which focus on the latter half of the 19th century, where I suppose the railway is developing quite quickly, whereas canals are mostly in place by the time that the OS is kind of getting running. So that's one kind of reason why we've tended to look at the railways. But we are currently hoping to get some new material digitized by the library, which does relate to the earlier period, which is based around, I suppose, some of the kind of property issues around getting hold of land to build infrastructure, which includes canals, among it. So once you have that, it would be.
Do you know the breakdown between goods transported by railways and goods transported by canals? So is there any evidence? Is there any documentation or sources for that?
I mean, there's loads of statistics on how much is transported by when. I mean, the bigger shift is probably from coastal transport to rail than canals.
Okay.
But they're all part of the mix. I wouldn't want to say we're not interested in those issues, but we're probably going to try and privilege, I suppose, more the kind of experiential, everyday life kind of issues, which are clearly being looked at in relation to these big infrastructural networks. But as Katie mentioned, a lot of work has been done on trying to calculate, the tonnage being moved from here to there. And the kind of thing that gets left out of those figures is, in a way, looking sort of up at those networks from below.
Yeah.
So if we're successful, I think our aim is to have a kind of qualitative understanding of those kind of interactions, but then at scale.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's sort of trying to stay as close to that contextual information as possible, and I think while while the work that's been done using, data about distances and cost effectiveness of transport dependent on vector data is really crucial for one kind, set of questions. A kind of social, cultural history set of questions is actually much better served by, hopefully, the tiling of the map and classification and giving us series of visual information to interpret qualitatively.
Lovely, thank you. James and then Justin.
As one of the conveners, I normally ask a quite historian-y question, and you did get me thinking. I'm not really a 19th centuryist, but you did get me thinking at one point about like Simon Gunn and stuff about authority and ritual of middle classes and the rise of that, and whether some of your work on like rail space interacts some of those theses around changing the urban middle class. But I want to ask a question about the neural networks and CNNs and kind of how you're using them, because I've been intrigued by these and playing with them recently on a few different things. So I kind of got 3 questions, and you can answer one or not. Don't feel like you have to answer all of them. My first question is really like, have you tested the kind of CNNs on other types of data just to kind of get a sense of whether or not what its behavior is, how creative CNNs are, and whether or not you're overfitting? You didn't say anything about recall at any point, and I wonder what your recall stats look like, because if they're too high, I'm more suspicious. At least if I'm doing it myself, I'm more suspicious. Sean Graham's been doing some really great work on asking CNNs questions, and his data is very much textual data, so he can like ask his network, his person he's created within there, a series of questions. I wondered if you thought about asking your CNNs questions. Can you find me a town? Can you find me a horse? There shouldn't be horses there, right? Can you find me a house? Like just asking it that way to think about that relationship. And the other one is kind of why you're doing so much labeling, because my understanding of CNNs to some extent is that it can throw up candidates of things and ask you to say, what is this? Is this a coherent group human? Is that because of the fact that things like ImageNet do take such a kind of photographic route that you almost have to create that baseline data because there's no baseline data to start with? Or can you just throw a bunch of maps at neural networks and say, find me things, find me groups, find me things that look kind of simple?
So maybe I start at the end. So with that, yes. So like one of the things that's really nice about these networks, especially when they're pre-trained, is if you, like in this image, the layer before you get to the label prediction, that's the layer where when you pass an image through, like as the output, there'll be some kind of representation of that image. And the thing that Casper was talking about, where you can do kind of similarity between words, you can do similar things with images. So that's basically how this visual retrieval works, is it finds like things that are visually similar through these kind of representations that the network learns. So we haven't played around with that much yet. I mean, I think one of the things we could try and do that at like a map sheet level and just see like what we get. But so far, yeah, we've not really played around with that much. In terms of like the labels, I mean, we could probably get away with less, but one of the things we've been trying to do is like make the annotation process efficient. And that's one of the reasons why sometimes we're using this like binary annotations, because then doing the actual annotation is very quick. So to label like 200 map tiles ends up taking like 10 minutes because your brain doesn't really have to think that much. It's just like yes or no, and you just have to click 1 or 2 buttons. And then, yeah, in terms of like the metrics, I mean, there's some of the tricks that we didn't really mention. So there's things like image augmentation. So when you have the label data, you basically apply some transformations to the image. So you might rotate it or zoom in, and then you use the same label. So essentially, as far as like the network is concerned, that's a new image. So that's really useful for avoiding this overfitting.
But just to link on that, like, do you know what it's not finding and you can't find?
Well,
because that's one of the problems of overfitting, right? You start never being able to find things that it should be.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, of course, you have like the validation data, so we can look at like what it's getting wrong. And the other thing that we haven't really mentioned that much here, but of course, like the output of the network is some confidence about a class. So you have like that's translated into a label. But one of the things that I think going forward we want to play with much more is the actual like confidence, because when you look at like the ones it's most confident about, it's like the kind of what you might say is like the atypical example of that, and then like the ones it's least confident about are like the slightly weird edge cases. And the other thing that you kind of mentioned of like, you know, having the human more in the loop is also something quite interesting. It's like active learning, where the model is giving you examples where it's most unsure and then asking for a human to say. I don't know if you want to say anything on the textual data.
I don't think my question really was touching
No,
on that.
I
Sorry.
didn't you see an end? So.
Yeah.
I would just say that we are interested in kind of moving backwards in time, right, and sort of seeing at what point, you know, models that work really well, our late 19th century series, begin to fail. And you know, a lot of this work that's happening in the GeoAI field is so focused on like making automatic vectorization work on these giant serial map collections. But historical map collections contain lots of other kinds of things. And Thomas van Dyck, for example, has been doing interesting work on like symbol pattern recognition in much more early modern maps that doesn't depend on CNN, and been quite successful at that. So, you know, how far do you push this method in time? Does that make sense? What are the other methods that are out there that will save you time and effort? Makes sense to explore.
Justin.
So I'll ask a historian question.
Thank you.
Exactly. So you started off with this really lovely idea of rail spaces, which I really liked. And basically, I want to know more about what your outputs answering that would look like. Your final slide on outputs was very much focused on methodological process outputs, and I totally get there's a kind of sandpit kind of purpose to all of this that makes that a really important output in its own right. But even if you're not going to do it, I don't know if you might, what would it look like? How would you go about creating conclusions from this at scale analysis? So you mentioned kind of zooming into case studies.
Yeah.
And if you're representing, if you're kind of analysis at scale of these kind of spaces, doesn't that just end up becoming quantitative kind of things? And if you're then zooming to case studies, what are you adding over a traditional analysis? Because obviously one of the big questions with any DH project is kind of
Why
just because you can do something, are you adding anything by doing it? So yeah, I'd love to. I'm not sure you're actually going to, it's kind of the point to deliver outputs like that, but what would they look like?
So I can start by saying something which slightly connects to the previous questioner's first question about class, which is to say that it's notoriously hard to get, for example, working class testimony about the 19th century. There is a small kind of, if you like, data set of memoirs which we're hoping to get access to, but even then it's a pretty tiny sort of idiosyncratic selection. Whereas, like you're hinting, the more typical story about the railways is one of railway users, travellers having wonderful kind of experiences. That's the horizons right for that. So in a way, one of them. I mean, this is if you like, prospective in terms of what we're hoping to do. The way that we're thinking about that is trying to construct a kind of analytical framework for thinking about the railways in terms of both amenity and disamenity. So whereas it might be quite clear who benefits from railways, it's less clear who suffers the, if you like, or invisible sort of disamenities. So, for example, you might be able to find spatial patterns about the kind of people living in the kind of areas where they're subject to the railway but don't get any benefit from it. And that might be a spatial kind of property. So that's one type of like research aim, if you like. And the kind of output that you're kind of hinting at, hopefully, if we can sort of make this work, would be like a history argument about the way that experience of living in those places can be inferred, if you like, using kind of spatial relations. There's a kind of further element to the research which might be to do with how land use changes. So there's a kind of a question about the politics, the kind of legal processes of like acquiring land, and that's more about the transition to, say, an industrialized landscape. So those are the kind of intuitions that are kind of pushing all of this kind of method, if you like. Can we get at those kind of issues that are not really visible in existing accounts? And the kind of form they might take would be, traditional historical scholarship, but with great depth to this kind of method.
Yeah, I would only add, and this helps give you a sense of the broader project too, that everything that we sort of are able to find in terms of patterns, things that seem surprising visually, if we can sort of turn around and think about those as questions that we can search for in our textual data in the newspapers, for example. Are there towns where certain kinds of features are disappearing and others are appearing? Are there debates about distance from stations? And then we can kind of take those questions into the newspapers. And what's driving a lot of us, what's driving us towards kind of the end of this project is a goal of having research that isn't just studying one corpus, but bringing those corpora together to get to be able to get a richer sense, more voices, more places.
I'll just add there is a tension about the relation between the case study and the kind of the macro scale. And in a way, I think we will end up with some kind of archetypal case studies, which we can read in a traditional way, but from which we can also
talk about broader similarity or uniqueness.
A much more concrete basis for this is a case study of this.
Right, which is also a common thing to say in DH, right? Like, now I have evidence of X. But I think that maps are quite interesting because we're so used to only being able to kind of work with very small sets of them. And it's just really exciting to be able to say, like, we are going to use machines to look at potentially, 1 million maps. And, how we then create information which we can digest as historians is sort of part of what we have to figure out. And so the scale of the arguments that we make depends on those decisions, which is fascinating and like completely undecided.
And we're definitely chewing over this problem of case study and how you learn from cases in a way is a kind of general problem, like in science and also, of course, in history. But it's normally a kind of unspoken thing that if you do a case study of a town, you're taking that town to stand for a generality of similar towns, but that's just implicit in historians' work. Whereas I suppose we're thinking about that explicitly. And we will probably fall foul of it in some way, but we're wrestling with that question.
We've seen a couple other questions. We'll start here and then we'll go here because you've already done one. We'll get back to you. Don't worry.
So I had a question about the names of the roads. You're pulling out these details about the schools and things like that, but about the road names in particular. And I was thinking about other data sources that would go with it. Of course, given you have the example of Liverpool, one thinks immediately of biographies of British business history and kind of matching those up together to understand people selling land, naming roads after themselves. The other thing, of course, when you talk about Liverpool is the slave history. I mean, there's a long-standing debate about the legacy of slaveholding on Liverpool, and you can go on walking tours in Liverpool, which will kind of peel back the layers to tell you this road used to be called this because of some connection to the slave trade. Can you extend that beyond Liverpool? Can you extend that to the whole of Lancashire? And are you going to use these kinds of road names in any way? That's not history from below at all, but history from above.
I mean, that's a really good point. We haven't talked about that. I do know someone who's doing a project using that kind of method to understand the influence of certain kind of industrial philanthropists in creating sites around Manchester. But no, we haven't talked about that. I think it's a good idea.
But the trade directories are,
Yeah.
we're kind of mapping, hopefully, digitizing, well, they've already been digitized, but extracting and parsing the text information in trade directories and kind of linking up what is present on the map explicitly versus what's in the trade directories for people and businesses and things like this. But the kind of work that would go into building a street level gazetteer for all of the 19th century is probably something we're not going to do. But it's a huge kind of open possibility that would allow a totally different granularity of research and connection with census data and things like that. But it's tough. It's very tough. Precisely the things that the automatic text recognition software tends to have big problems with are things that are like on diagonals and not so street names.
I have a question from the more built and natural heritage perspective. So I wondered if the time series data that we get from these layers and layers of maps would let me say anything quantitatively about built natural landscape features that were lost as the railways were expanded.
Yeah, I mean that's precisely the kind of thing we're hoping to do. Unfortunately, with OS maps, there's quite a limited number of data points in the series because they won't be surveyed that often. But again, if we were to choose particular areas where the surveying was more frequent, we could certainly hopefully very informative about those kind of changes. Unfortunately, for the main set of maps we're looking at, there's a kind of 40-year gap between survey dates, so quite a lot of changes. So we'd have to be kind of very targeted and really about that.
Acres of woodland or historic houses, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of people interested in forest like cover and building stock. So there are some other researchers at the Turing who are just doing that instance segmentation of every building in all of London, all of the UK. But their focus is on being able to trace the housing stock over time. Very detailed.
Yeah, kind of connected with that. I was just wondering if you were going to be using other mapping like Goad maps for more detailed mapping for some areas. And I'd also got a question of you mentioned land acquisition. Did they have like compulsory purchase orders, or when did that kind of come in? It made me think that I've got no idea when that legislation came in. Was that around in the 19th century? How did they like acquire land off people?
Yeah, exactly. So on Goad maps, I skipped over the slide which showed Goad maps just so I didn't want to confuse people with too many different types of maps. But yeah, we're going to have hopefully touch wood access to Goad maps, which, as you probably know,
Geo-reference.
Yeah. So those who don't know, Goad is a fire insurance company who went around the country surveying in great detail particularly valuable areas where fire insurance was needed for industrial properties. So they're very high scale, very detailed. So they're really a great source, but unfortunately are quite sort of spotty in the coverage of the country. So they got loads of leads other places, but randomly not other places. So again, that would require some sort of strategic work. We'd want to be able to cross-refer those to our other maps and sources, but hopefully we will use those. In terms of compulsory purchase, yes, Acts of Parliament, private Acts of Parliament were the main way that this happened. So in the late 18th century, there's a whole period in which there loads and loads of these private acts being passed all the time to allow people to acquire land to precisely build infrastructure. Roads was a big sort of focus of that legislation. So yeah, that's being digitised at the moment. And we're going to also be doing some work with Hansard and other data sets as time goes on, where we can hopefully get a kind of angle on the way land is acquired.
That's really interesting.
You kind of spoke about the technical context very much in terms of DH, especially when you use the term land use. It means that actually remote sensing people are doing exactly this kind of AI stuff as well. I just had a look. There's actually a tool set in ArcGIS on the shelf doing some of that kind of stuff. How does that work fit in with what you're doing? Did the kind of black and white nature of maps actually pose extra challenges compared to what's out there in the GIS world, which assumes certain kind of?
Yeah, I mean that's part of the interest is connecting with that community of they now call themselves GeoAI scholars who are sort of maybe trained to work with satellite imagery and now find themselves starting to be interested in scanned map collections, and they bring those methods, across, and they are kind of treating those maps like satellite imagery. Hence, all of our talking about understanding the sources, right? Like that's where historians can bring a lot of value to that conversation in thinking about what it makes sense to put a lot of effort into developing a tool to recognize, right? Like how much can you trust something about the production of this map? How that varies across series, right? Just because something makes sense to do on US quad maps may not make sense to do it on Ordnance Survey maps or vice versa. And so, like, for example, the Strabo tool was originally developed and kind of fine-tuned with US quad topographic maps. And, us applying it to the OS raises new questions. But yeah, so a lot of it has to do with different sources.
I mean, you had to start from the kind of ground up.
Yeah. I think it's important to say that we didn't want to just start, we didn't want to just plug into ArcGIS, right? And say like, what can ArcGIS do for us? It was really important for us to kind of, I mean, we've said creativity a few times tonight, but to be allowed to be more creative. And I think there's just such a temptation when you load your map in, and we're lucky to have a lot of maps that are already geo-referenced, right? So, okay, you've already done the geo-referencing, you load it into ArcGIS or QGIS or whatever. What are you going to do? Oh, I'm going to vectorize that data, right? Or that is the kind of compulsion almost. And so if you take that, prize away, can you think about seeing the source differently? Right, and kind of like coming back to maybe a more humanistic way of looking at the map. I love GIS software, and it does lots of important things for specific questions. But it was an experiment to step outside of that toolkit, so to speak.
James.
Okay, I'll ask another question. Can I ask a historian question then? Because I'm really intrigued. I know we're nearly in the time. I'm really intrigued about some of your research methods in relation to the fact you're studying the past, right? And I'm intrigued as to when you're thinking about as a team the kind of traditions in which you're situated, whether they are we're going to reject some of the traditions coming from, say, people who see historical maps as satellite data, right? You're rejecting some traditions in a research domain over here. I'm really intrigued as to where you think this project situates itself and seeks to contribute in terms of historiographical traditions. Because you're using the stuff of print scholarship in maps ultimately. And many people who work on maps treat them as though they are prints and see them in relationship to print scholarship, which is very much about attribution, understanding provenance of those objects. You're doing a lot of work to do with urban spaces and businesses and streets, which is very much the stuff of the kind of more quantitative end of the business history, for example. And you're doing some stuff in there as well, which seems to, with the comments about rail space and stuff, seems to kind of situate itself alongside kind of the more kind of cultural histories of the 19th century, right? I'm just really intrigued as to kind of, as a project team, I'm not wanting you to have an intellectual grounding all in a series of historical things, but I'm just intrigued as to where is that kind of central point coming from? Where do you have clear points of reference as a project team in relation to that? Or have you decided to abandon that as a method, as a starting point, and maybe kind of come to that later and go, right, what have we found? How do we write a paper that fits with these traditions so we can get through journal X? I'm just intrigued, and like, you may not want to be super honest about the last point, I guess, but like, I'm just really intrigued, because that's something about big collaborative projects that I find really interesting, when they are driven by a group of people who are coming up as a collective, but ultimately working on and with the I'm not. The question isn't like, have you all read one book that's the same,
Well,
or one
I
article
think
that's the same? But like, I'm intrigued, right?
Okay, so there's loads of things to say about that. So looking at it from one perspective, like the Industrial Revolution has probably possibly the biggest, most contested historiography like there is of any topic, certainly British history, maybe beyond that. So trying to sort of like make a dent or make a mark into that literature is very difficult, particularly when that field itself is so fragmented into micro approaches that really don't speak to each other. So in a kind of fantasy world, we might do something that would link up some of the kind of quantitative stuff that economic historians are doing, which touches on the kind of stuff you can do better or more quickly with digital approaches, with some qualitative work from the cultural history, or the kind of very rich histories of mythology and representations of the Industrial Revolution, which is itself a whole other kind of field. If we can somehow bring it together by using these different sources, that would be an amazing achievement. Whether that's possible or not, we don't yet know. And certainly there is no like central point. There's no kind of focal point around which all of this kind of sits, really. So in terms of a single disciplinary home,
I guess it's not a single disciplinary home. It's just like, I don't know. I often wonder whether I really want you to make wonderful contributions which historians cite, for example. And I often wonder whether it's possible to make wonderful contributions that historians cite without making historians feel like you're part of the thing which is there, even if it's a sub area, right? They feel like you're part of that. And I just find that really interesting as a kind of, because I'm happy for you to reject that as well and say, I want to make contributions that like a bunch of people over here cite.
I think we want to do both, which is maybe ambitious and greedy, but we do have a lot of resources, and I think we should be able to. And collectively, we have the kind of like time to hopefully do that. I think it's it's not a normal project where we all are hired because we all kind of take exactly the same approach to a topic and are very kind of packaged up very, very closely like that. But we do all have things in common. And what's actually been really wonderful, I mean, maybe, I don't know if you guys agree, I hope you agree, that we're learning this like first year has really been us learning about those commonalities and about the differences and the common ground and where we might want to go together, right? And the history field is so fragmented. I mean, we're just, we're doing this kind of literature review for the rail space project. And it's like, well, these 20 different kinds of people write about rail or stations or land use in these ways. And so how do we, I kind of want to, you have to bring all that together and think about contributing to multiple fields. And we do that as historians when we write something anyways, especially now we say, oh, I'm not just a historian of 19th century labor. I'm also talking about political culture. And right, it's these things are all intersecting. And I hope that our work demonstrates that.
I mean, there is.
Yeah.
I mean, there are questions about like what kind of evidence and argument would historians accept in general, and that feels like, even though it's explicitly not one of our metrics, that does implicitly kind of bubble up quite often. Whereas, people kind of take for granted that by doing a cool method of solving a problem, technical, coming up with something that's transferable, well, that just has merit in itself. Then the question often then arises, well, will historians like this accept it, be convinced by it, so
Understand it.
or even understand what's going on? And so there is kind of translation sort of like problem, which I guess a lot of digital historians have, which is how can you make something compelling to that like home community? For example, we've been talking a lot about outputs and authorship and these kind of questions. Like they come up very quickly when you start planning out this kind of research. Where are you going to publish it? Who's even going to be the author? What genre is it going to be? For some people, well, obviously the outcome's going to be a book. And you look around the room and half people go, I have no interest in writing a book. I never read books, so why would I want to write one? So yeah, we're trying to work out.
Or like whether you're allowed to write a single author piece, which froze.
So yeah, I think for the literary, historical people, a book is the kind of like gold standard output you have. So we need to just find ways of getting stuff out in the right places that works not only for people individually, but just to move the research to a place where it actually.
I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to. Yeah, we're going to have to bring it to a close. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to you indeed for your questions and everything else. I should say we're going to retire to the pub, or not really retire, but move to the pub and to continue the discussion elsewhere. You're all welcome to do that. And I should say industrial action depending. We may be meeting again in 2 weeks' time on the 3rd of March. Keep an eye out on our blog to see whether indeed we are, and if we are, we welcome you all again. Thank you very much. Sorry for making myself.
Cecil's name in the pub again.
Sorry.